The Philadelphia Eagles have the deepest roster in the NFL in 2025, but what position could be the most in trouble if there are injuries this year? We'll get into it coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Thursday edition of the show. I'm your host, as always, Louis DiBiase. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 back in bonus bets. All you got to do is win your first $5 bet. I think it's a slam dunk, foregone conclusion. The consensus opinion agrees. The Philadelphia Eagles not only have the best, most talented, top-heavy roster in the NFL heading into 2025, coming off a Super Bowl win, but they also have the deepest roster with very little holes at any position on both sides of the football, offense and defense. I think that's clear and obvious. Pro Football Focus has been ranking their positions throughout the last couple of weeks, and the Eagles were number one in the majority of these categories. They were top 5, at least top 10 in pretty much every spot. Top to bottom, Howie Roseman has built this thing like a juggernaut through free agency, through trades, through the draft, short-term, long-term talent. The Eagles, you name it, they have everything you need. Versatile talent, speed, size, everything. Like anything you're looking for. If you're going to the supermarket that is an NFL roster and saying, I need this and this and this and this, but I don't want to take all these trips, what roster can I go to and pick it clean? It would be the Eagles roster. But I will say, there is one position. Like, if you ask the question, let's say the Eagles run into injuries this year. What position could be in trouble the most? Where could there be a significant drop-off compared to the starter, or the biggest drop-off compared to the starter? What position is that? The Eagles have been lucky. They have not dealt with a lot of serious injuries since this new era, the Jalen Hurts, Nick Sirianni era. We're used to this catastrophic, historic amount of injuries in 2017 taking place, 2018, 2019, 2020. The Doug Peterson, Carson Wentz era was riddled and plagued with injuries. All we've known with Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni in this core is a fully healthy roster. Let's say that's not the case in 2025, and their luck catches up to them, and they have to really rely on their depth. Like, their depth of this roster, a young depth chart, is really tested this year. I think they're okay in a lot of spots, but what position might have the biggest drop-off? For me, I do believe it's offensive tackle. I think tackle is obviously the spot that would have the biggest drop-off. And I really do like what the Eagles have done with their depth chart for Jeff Stoutland. Stoutland University has a lot of intriguing long-term pieces, like obviously bringing in Hinton, Williams, Kendall, on day 3 of the draft. Like, I think Drew Kendall can be a long-term center or guard, primary backup. I think he could even start at right guard in 2025. I've said that on our squad show. I think Cameron Williams could be the steal of the draft. A lot of analysts say, draft experts say, if he was in next year's draft, this could be a second or third round pick instead of a day 3 selection. I think Miles Hinton is a massive human being with a lot of raw traits that Stoutland could turn into a legitimate player on the offensive line. But these are all rookies that we're talking about. These are all inexperienced players that if you go from Jordan Mailata or Lane Johnson to one of those guys, like, I feel like from the jump in year 1, it's probably going to be a bigger drop-off than it would have been going to Fred Johnson last year. And now the Eagles did sign a veteran with a lot of starting experience. They did bring in Kendall Lamb from the Miami Dolphins, who started 7 games last year for Miami. He started 8 games in 2023. So they do have some experience to replace Fred Johnson. But overall, like, Kendall Lamb, I think, is a downgrade from who Fred Johnson was. I like the young depth, but you got to remember the Eagles have 2 of the top 5 tackles in the NFL. So by that bar that's set in Philadelphia, it's going to be the biggest drop-off going from one of them to potentially a day 3 rookie or a Kendall Lamb. But also just in general, I think in the NFL, tackle is normally where the biggest drop-off takes place on most rosters. So I don't really think this should be that surprising of a take. I mean, just look what happens when Lane Johnson doesn't play in football games for the Eagles since, 2016, like when he's dealt with injuries or suspensions. This team is nowhere near the same when Lane Johnson's not out there. And I think it would be a similar thing if Jordan Mailata wasn't at left tackle. One thing they could consider, though, if they don't believe in Kendall Lamb, if these rookies just aren't ready to be primary backups to Lane and to Mailata, I do wonder if, and Tyler Steen's the starting right guard right now, so he's going to be in that spot. But I do wonder if there was a long-term injury to Lane Johnson or Jordan Mailata, would they consider putting Tyler Steen at tackle, where he played primarily at Alabama before the Eagles took him in the third round to be an inside-out kind of tweener pick. Maybe they consider that. Either way, I think when you look at tackle compared to even guard, I think the guard options are a lot better. You look at maybe wide receiver would be a big drop-off, but you also have Dallas Goedert in this equation, and you have Jahan Dotson. Linebacker actually has a good amount of depth this year. So does the defensive line. I like the secondary depth too. Maybe if one of those top corners got hurt, you're talking Eli Ricks and Adoree Jackson. But I think the biggest drop-off, where the Eagles could be in the most trouble this year if they suffer injuries, would be especially Lane Johnson. If they lose Lane this year at any point, I think that could cause issues. But again, the Eagles are extremely deep at pretty much every position. I do really like a lot of their tackle depth. I like a lot of their options, but like a lot of this roster that's pretty expensive at the top now, you got to get younger and cheaper below the top, the top 22 starters of this roster. When those guys are getting top 10 annual salaries at each position across the offense, your depth chart can't be as expensive with veteran talent. And naturally, that's going to make your roster more of a projection. It's going to be less proven, but these guys got to go out there and show it. And I think training camp will really help us kind of get a feel for what they have, not just with their starters, obviously. I think we know what they have in their starters, but what we have in a lot of these backups that are going to have to step up, because now a Moro Ijoma type is going to go from a rotational backup to a starter. Jalix Hunt as well. So as those backup role players from last year move up to starting spots, now these backups, these third strings, these newbies from the draft and free agency, they got to step up into those roles as well. So I think tackle would be my answer for where the biggest drop-off could be if there are injuries this year. I do think, and Lane Johnson talked about it the other day, about knowing that Father Time is undefeated in the NFL, even though he mentally feels young. He knows the reality of the NFL with aging linemen, that they can't play forever. I do think this is going to be the year in 2026, this upcoming NFL draft, where the Eagles finally do draft a tackle in the first two rounds. They haven't done that since taking Andre Dillard in 2019. I personally don't love having a tackle be redshirted for multiple years, waiting in the wings. But I think next year they'll probably say, okay, Lane at this point probably has 1 or 2 more years. Let's bring in that tackle now so we're not caught off guard when he retires and we're not trying to scramble. Let's be a little proactive. I don't want them to be extremely proactive and take a guy that's waiting for 2 to 3 years. But if they know Lane's going to retire next year or in 2027, which I think he probably will at that point, especially if they get another ring this year or that year, I think this will probably be the year they finally invest in the tackle position early in the draft, because although I like the young guys right now, they don't really have that next stud waiting in the wings, right? They don't have that Jordan Mailata behind Jason Peters and Lane Johnson, and maybe they do. Maybe one of those day 3 guys are that player, but I think next year is where that significant asset is used on tackle for the first time in, at that point, it would have been crazy enough 7 years, which is nuts, but that's the reality. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. I was thinking about this the other day as I was hosting Locked On NFL, talking about the Washington Commanders this year. Are they going to be better than 2024, or are they going to be worse? For me, I do wonder who could be this year's Commanders. Who could be a team that missed the playoffs last year in the NFC that pushes the Eagles in 2025? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. This Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing. We got Wimbledon tomorrow, the semifinals. Can't wait to watch some tennis. Whether you're also into baseball under the lights, golf's been going on as well. High-stakes soccer action. FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. Whether you're placing a same-game parlay or watching a bet ride into the ninth inning, FanDuel makes it feel like you're part of the action. New to FanDuel? Well, new customers can get a $5 bet. You win that bet, you're going to get $150 back in bonus bets if that first bet wins. So open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thanks as always for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. So I was thinking about this after seeing the Commanders. They didn't change their jerseys. They brought back their vintage look as their alternate. You look at also Locked On NFL. We were talking about, are the Commanders going to regress this year? Was last year a sign of things to come? And it's the new normal for the Commanders. They're going to compete for NFC championships and Super Bowls. Or did they really, really overachieve in Jaden Daniels' rookie year? So we were discussing that, and I started to think about the Commanders, about what they did last year. And I started to wonder, looking at the NFC landscape, who could be this year's version of last year's Commanders? A team that maybe they have a young quarterback. Maybe they made a lot of splash moves in free agency this year, or they had a great draft. Maybe they're in a weaker division. They have that last place schedule or a third place schedule. Who could be a team that missed the playoffs in 2024? That this year not only makes the playoffs, but potentially does what the Commanders did last year and goes on this Cinderella run and really pushes the teams at the top of this conference, like the Philadelphia Eagles, who are the favorite in the NFC this year. They are the cream of the crop in this conference. Who could be that football team? For me, there's three teams that I'm really looking at. It's the Atlanta Falcons, it's the Chicago Bears, and then it's the San Francisco 49ers. If gun to my head, there's a surprise team this year in the NFC that made a deep playoff run that the Eagles are surprisingly playing in the second round or the NFC Championship. So not the Los Angeles Rams, not the Detroit Lions, not even the Green Bay Packers or the Washington Commanders. Who's that team that wasn't in the big dance last year that could go from worst to first? I really think the Falcons could be that football team. And Michael Penix, I have questions about his ceiling, and I'm not just saying this because he's a lefty, but he really does give me Tua vibes. I think he's a high floor starter with a low ceiling. I don't think he can make every throw. It's an average arm strength. He's kind of mobile. He has an injury history. He's an older player. I wouldn't have taken Penix in the first round if I was Atlanta, but I do think when you look at their roster and Penix's experience, getting Washington into the college football playoff, into the national championship a couple years ago, what he did even in his rookie year last year in the second half of the year, he is a high floor player. I think he's good. I don't know if he'll ever be great, but for the Falcons and what their roster looks like this season, I think Penix could be enough for them to make a deep playoff run. Could he be their version of what Baker Mayfield is to Tampa Bay? Can he be in that tier with a Jared Goff or a Jordan Love and a Brock Purdy, a Dak Prescott? I don't think that would be crazy. If he's in that, second tier of quarterbacks, if he became that player with Atlanta's support system, I wouldn't be shocked at all. Atlanta has a very underrated roster, and I think they're in a pretty weak division. I think Tampa Bay is a really good football team, as we know in Philadelphia, but New Orleans might be the worst team in football this year, and I don't think Carolina still is going to be very good, even with Bryce Young's steps he took last year. On top of that, Atlanta's got a roster that they were, in fact, there's only two offensive lines last year, according to PFF, that had top 10 pass and run blocking grades. It was Atlanta and Philadelphia. So Michael Penix has one of, if not the best offensive line, top three in football. He has one of the best offensive lines in the NFL in front of him. He's got Drake London, who had a breakout season on the outside. He's got Darnell Mooney, who I think is one of the most underrated receivers in the NFL, kind of had a mini breakout season last year as well. Make fun of Kyle Pitts all you want for fantasy owners. I know he's so frustrating, but in NFL terms, he's a good starting tight end. Bijan Robinson is one of the best playmakers in football. He's one of the best young running backs in the NFL. Michael Penix has very similar to what Jalen Hurts had in 2022. Does he have an A.J. Brown or even a Devontae Smith? Probably not, but London, Mooney, Pitts, and Bijan with a top 10, top 5, maybe top 3 offensive line, and Michael Penix in the NFC South with a schedule that is not one of the hardest in football, If you told me they were this year's Commanders that went on a run and made it to the Final Four of the NFL, would I be shocked? Not at all. I think that's a team to really keep an eye on is the Atlanta Falcons. They kind of give me Eagles vibes from 2022, and I love what they did on defense. They actually had my favorite draft this year. They got both Jalen Walker and James Pierce, which is incredible. To add those two pass rushers on top of signing Leonard Floyd in free agency, Arnold Ebiketie had back-to-back 6-sack seasons. If he's your fourth guy in the rotation now, it looks like Atlanta finally fixed their pass rush on the edge. I love the fact that they got both Walker and Pierce for that defensive line. I also love the pick on day 2 of Xavier Watts from Notre Dame. The guy had 7 interceptions last year. You add him with Jesse Bates and A.J. Terrell and that secondary. Like, Atlanta could be a sleeping giant in the NFC. I also think another sleeping giant could be the Chicago Bears. If Ben Johnson, who is one of the best play callers in the NFL, if he gets Caleb Williams to reach his ceiling, or even has him playing at like what Jared Goff, his level has been over the past couple years, I think that's a sleeping giant in the NFC. The Chicago Bears have a really good defense that carried them to a 4-2 record last year. With all their problems last year, they were almost, before the Jaden Daniels Hail Mary, they were about to be 3 games over 500 almost halfway through the year at 5-2. After that game, it changed everything. And they had bad coaching, they had a terrible offensive line, and yet they still were almost 5-2 at one point last year. Now you add Ben Johnson, Caleb Williams heading into his second season. I think their offensive line got a lot better. They added playmakers like Colston Loveland out of Michigan, the tight end in the first round of this past draft. They have DeAndre Swift at running back. They have Rome Odunze and DJ Moore, which is a really good 1-2 punch at receiver. Cole Kmet now is your second tight end, along with Colston Loveland. Like, that's a really good 12 personnel package. The Chicago Bears, I think that's a team, and again, they have a 4th place schedule. They're in a really tough division, but I think they're going to be better than Minnesota this year. If you told me they were better than Detroit or Green Bay as well, would I be shocked? I wouldn't be. So I think the Bears and the Falcons are two of those younger teams with young quarterbacks that have not made the playoffs in a while, that this year suddenly could be a legit contender. Kind of like even who, not just who Washington was last year, but this has happened 2 years in a row. The Green Bay Packers 2 years ago were the youngest roster in the NFL, and they beat the Dallas Cowboys in the first round and nearly upset the 49ers on the road to get to the NFC Championship game, to play Detroit. So this has happened 2 years in a row. I think that team this year could be Atlanta or Chicago. If it's a veteran team that's done it before, that's bouncing back from a bad season in 24, I think it's the San Francisco 49ers. Again, a last place schedule. Their schedule is very favorable this year. They were so injured last year, and while they're still one of the older rosters in football, and that's always going to lead to more injury risk, if they do stay healthy, I still think Kyle Shanahan's one of the best play callers in football. They still have enough playmakers with Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey. I like Ricky Parasol at receiver and Juwan Jennings. That's still a good enough offense to make the playoffs, to do some damage in January. That's a good defense still as well. So if there was a team that wasn't young, more of a proven team that bounces back this year, taking advantage of a easier schedule, I think that's the 49ers. I don't think they are who they were in 2023. That was a juggernaut of a roster, almost as good as the 2024 Eagles team. But I still think they're good enough to be a team that could potentially win playoff games next year. So this year's Commanders, this year's 2023 Packers, who could that be? I'm saying Atlanta, Chicago, or San Francisco. Let me know what you think. Hit us up on X at DiBiaseLOE or at Locked On Birds. Coming up next, we're going to wrap up this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles. I want to compare Jalen Hurts to some athletes around the world of sports. I'll tell you why coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. All right, we are wrapping up this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles. Thanks, as always, for making us your first listen each and every day. So I was thinking about our conversation we had on the show yesterday with Jalen Hurts, like how people judge him, how they rank him among other quarterbacks, how people evaluate him compared to other signal callers. And I started to wonder, like, because Jalen Hurts, I do think, is evaluated very uniquely in the NFL. He is not ranked or analyzed the same as Joe Burrow, as Josh Allen, as Patrick Mahomes. I think he suffers from what Cam Newton suffered from, what Lamar Jackson suffers from, what even Russell Wilson, to a degree, suffered from. these quarterbacks that are really, really good in their own right. They're truly special talents, elite players. Even, heck, they've won championships. They have elite production. Their numbers, like individual numbers, check the box. Team success, check the box. Why are these guys not evaluated or judged the same way as a Josh Allen, as a Pat Mahomes, as a Joe Burrow? I think it's because even, heck, a Justin Herbert, it's because it looks different. It's because they're elite in a different way. They're elite in a way that analysts and fans aren't used to quarterbacks being elite like this. They're not used to quarterbacks winning this way, being productive this way, and they're almost like hurt because of that. Like their rankings are almost damaged because of their play style, because if they're not the surgical pocket passer that just throws for 5,000 yards and 32 passing touchdowns a year, they're not seen in the same tier as those other guys. And obviously that's like the main, most important part of playing quarterback. But I think we can all agree Cam Newton was an elite quarterback that almost won a championship. Russell Wilson was an elite quarterback at a time that won a championship. Jalen Hurts is an elite quarterback that's won a championship, but they all suffer because of their play style. They're elite in a different way, and they suffer because of that. I do wonder, I was starting to think about this after the show, like what athletes across sports also kind of deal with what Jalen Hurts is dealing with right now. Like if I had to compare him to other athletes, like he is the NFL's version of blank, who is Jalen Hurts for the NFL. I actually think there's two obvious players in the NBA, to make a basketball analogy or a comparison, that makes all the sense in the world. The first one, I think he's let me preface this with this. He's a less cringy version, way less cringy. He's a less cringy version of Jason Tatum. Let me tell you why. Both of these players, I think, are clearly top 5 at their position or just overall players in the NFL. I think Jalen Hurts is a top 5 quarterback in football. I think Jason Tatum is a top 10 NBA player, top 5 NBA player when he's healthy. That's who he was in 2023 and 2024. Both these players are in their prime. Both have won a championship in the last 2 years. Both have been to multiple championships, consistently getting to the Final Four of their league's playoffs. And they just win. They've always won since the beginning of their career. Even when you're supposed to take, these step-by-step kind of directions into becoming a star, Tatum and Hurts, they kind of fast-forwarded the process early in their careers. And yet both get very underrated, overlooked. Now, for different reasons, but both guys, you would think with hearing the back-and-forth conversations, the dialogue about these two players, you would not say, based on the judgment of analysts, that they're top 5 guys at their position, even though the proof is in the pudding. I think both are severely still underrated in their league. And they also, I think they both get punished. Why they get underrated, one thing that's common between the two is that they have great support systems. They have great teams with great management, great coaches, and great players around them. Jason Tatum had Jaylen Brown when he won a championship. He had Drew Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis. He had Al Horford. He had Derek White. Jalen Hurts has A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Saquon Barkley, the best offensive line in football, the best defense in football. And while that's true that they have those support systems that make it easier for them, they don't have to carry as much as other stars across the league. They're victims of their support system because people now act like they can't carry their football team because they don't have to as much. But I think Jason Tatum and Jalen Hurts have both proven if they need to carry their football team, their basketball team, they can absolutely do it. So who is Jalen Hurts in the NFL? I think he's the NFL's version of a Jason Tatum. Or the other analogy, the other comparison I'd make in the NBA is he's kind of the NFL's version of Jimmy Butler, right? He's not always an elite, spectacular player, game after game after game in the regular season. He's not always putting up the points, the yardage, the stats of these other elite players. Like, Jimmy Butler's not putting up Luka Doncic numbers or even Jason Tatum numbers always, game after game. Jalen Hurts isn't always putting up Josh Allen or Joe Burrow numbers or Lamar Jackson game after game. But kind of like Patrick Mahomes, kind of like Jimmy Butler, Jalen Hurts, he's not always elite in every game, but he's always elite in the games that he has to be elite. The games that matter the most. Name a moment since, I would say that going back to the last time he wasn't great in a big moment was like 2021, the playoffs against Tampa Bay. Name the last time Jalen Hurts, the Eagles needed him to be truly special, and he didn't step up to the challenge. Like, I think that's Jimmy Butler. He's not seen as a consensus top 10 player in the NBA, but somehow he got the Miami Heat, not one of the best rosters in the NBA, to 2 NBA finals in 4 years. Now, he didn't get a ring, but Jimmy Butler, whenever he needed to step up in the playoffs, like, he was that guy for an 8-seed Miami Heat that in 2023 brought the Heat all the way to the finals, upsetting the Boston Celtics, and took the Denver Nuggets to 5 or 6 games? And with that roster against Jokic, that's a pretty incredible feat. So kind of thinking about like how Hurts is treated in the NFL, who he's like around the world of sports, I'd say he's like Jason Tatum or Jimmy Butler. I think that's who Jalen Hurts is for the NFL. He's the NFL's version of Tatum or Butler. Let me know what you think. Hit us up on X at DiBiaseLOE or at DiBiase, or I said DiBiaseLOE, at Locked On Birds. You can hit us up as well on our YouTube community page. And thanks as always for making us your first listen each and every day. Got 2 shows for you tomorrow. I got my solo show as well as our Locked On Eagles squad podcast live on YouTube starting at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Until then, thanks as always for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.